Good morning, Luigi Narbone, Director of the Middle East Directions Program of the UI. The session on exiting the world economy at the MENA Dialogue conference in Rome just ended. It was based on the findings of the recent ebook on fracture stability. What can you draw from the discussion that just took place?
Well, it has been a very interesting panel. We thought that this topic is particularly relevant for the international communities as well as for local stakeholders and above all for war-torn conflict countries in the Middle East and North Africa. There is an issue of how to conceive a reconstruction. In the next phase, of course, the conflicts are still ongoing and they are, of course, still taking an enormous toll in terms of human life and human suffering, and there is enormous devastation in terms of physical infrastructure, but above all, what is needed is to think about the future of reconstruction. It is obvious that the political dimension and the economic dimensions go together. It is very difficult not to think about how the economic reconstruction will take place once the conflict are over. We discussed a lot about the approach. It is obvious that what the international community has done in terms of supporting a state-based approach for reconstruction is today particularly challenging given the conditions on the ground. War economies are clearly a continuation of the feature of the economies of those countries, made of corruption. Certainly, there is a high degree of predation, exclusion. Economic elites move from both licit and illicit activities and take advantage of the resources with a strong struggle around them, which makes reconstruction and above all creating the conditions and the institutions and the reforms that are needed to move away from war economies towards development, particularly challenging. That was the theme of the panel. What needs to be done? Everybody knows the recipes, everybody knows what would be needed, but it's extremely difficult to have a consensus on how to do it. And we had a very interesting discussion on alternative approaches. Very much was discussed about a bottom-up approach that somehow takes into account the specific conditions of those countries and the war economies, and looks at ways for the international community to fund the activities for reconstruction, looking at community and local development and reconstruction, looking at ways to really take care of the needs of the people.
Professor Stephen Heidemann and Al-Sagar Hamasaid highlighted in particular the distance from the theoretical conceptualization of reconstruction to the on-the-ground activities when it comes to boundaries between categories that disappear when you touch with the practice.
In theory, you can apply sort of a phasing in of assistance, looking at early recovery, looking at the way humanitarian aid can help in tackling specific issues during the conflict and the immediate post-conflict, but also separating it from the reforms and the efforts that are needed to start reconstruction and move towards resumption of development. But when you hit the ground, as was said in the panel, the situation is quite different. The borders they become blurred, and it's extremely difficult to conceive policies that can be useful and applicable to the situations, especially considering that all these conflicts are still ongoing. There is still a lot of devastation being provoked by military action on the ground, by non-state actors' activities on the ground, but at the same time communities suffer. There is a huge problem in terms of IDPs and refugees return, and above all, how to start economic recovery and development again.
As you mentioned, social destruction is one of the main relevant aspects that perhaps are less involved into, less taken into consideration when it comes to planned reconstruction of post-conflict or war-torn countries. The State Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan highlighted this in terms of recalling their experience from the end of the Second World War, and also gave an interesting clue on how healthcare and education can be the investment for long-term sustainable reconstruction.
The State Minister for Foreign Affairs talked about the Japanese experience and the Japanese approach, looking at the preconditions in terms of security and human security, but also focus on the need to invest in human capital, education and health as keys to secure a long-term sustainability of the reconstruction effort. Those are extremely important issues. The conditions, of course, need to be there. Security needs to be restored. But the main objective is to ensure human security, to ensure that the conditions for the people to return and to start the real reconstruction process are there, but should not be disentangled and from the fact that the countries need a sense of direction. That what makes the intervention by the international community difficult, because obviously there are difficulties in terms of understanding the political direction of these countries, and there is clearly too many problems on the ground still. But we need to, at the same time, to think about the future, and the future is, of course, investing in education and investing on the people, on the human capital, so that the countries can take a path towards sustainable development and insertion in the global value chain, and all the actors, including the private sector, should play a role on that, to ensure that also at the level of the region, at the level of Middle East and North Africa, finally the regions can undertake a virtuous cycle of growth and development.
Thank you, Director. And as a closing, we remind that the ebook is available on free access, can be downloaded in PDF format.
Yes, the book is, of course, freely downloadable, and we hope that the reading can be useful to understand some of the current dynamics in war-torn countries, but also start a reflection on the alternative approaches for reconstruction.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.